Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this week's video, I'm going to be working on the drawers behind, which as you can see are already sanded. The reason for that is because they had water damage and they sat in a unit that got a little leak. We've had a lot of rain in the UK and all the drawers were kind of stuck in. A little bit of repair work has been done to them, but I am at the stage now where I can get painting, and that is exactly what I'm going to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is attempt to kind of make these drawers look a little bit older than what they are, because these are actually quite a modern set. They are completely solid pine, but they're not old. So I'm going to try and make the wood look a little bit older and a little bit more aged. And I'm going to do that with a paint wash. And I'm going to do that for a couple of reasons. So a paint wash is really easy to apply paint over the top of, and it dries relatively quickly. It's really easy to work with. If I'd have used a oil-based stain like no paint gel stain, that would have potentially given me problems with bleed through into the paint that I'm going to use. I am using lighter colours this time, and the water-based stains would have worked because obviously they don't present the same problem, but there isn't really one that's very dark in the Voodoo Gel Stain range. So this is going to be the quickest and easiest way to give me that kind of effect that I'm going for, which is just an older kind of look to the wood. So the colour that I've used is Coffee Bean, and that's from Dixie Belle's Chalk Mineral Paint range. And I've watered it down in a like kind of roughly 50-50 ratio, but I haven't measured it out. I've just kind of done it by eye. I just wanted to make sure that it was really runny. Dixie Belle paints are very pigmented anyway, and you can see how well this is covering, even though it is really watered down. And I'm just whacking it on with a brush so that it kind of soaks into the wood grain, and then I'm just going to slightly wipe it back a little bit, and that's just going to give me the wood grain is just going to kind of be prominent through it, so it's not just going to be like a solid block of brown. It is going to look like a wood stain. I'm just tending to work in smaller areas of this because I am wiping it back before it has a chance to dry, and it is drying quickly because it's going over the top of raw wood, and as you can see it's just sucking it up. So I'm just working in small areas, wiping it back and then moving along. I'm also not removing the handles on this because they are dowel fitted and they're also glued in, and there's 13 drawers. My original plan was to make this a kind of industrial apothecary kind of vibe, which is one of my favourite kind of looks to go for. But the drawer handles were just not coming off. And I'd already done quite a lot of work to this piece to get it right because of the water damage. So I had to adjust a lot of the drawer dimensions and sand a lot of it down. So I just really didn't want to do any more work to this at all. I didn't want to fight it. So the drawer handles are staying on. So I let the Coffee Bean dry, and when it was dry, it was quite a lot lighter, which is absolutely fine, and that's usually what happens with a paint wash when you use darker colours. If I'd have put a top coat over this, it probably would have gone a little bit darker. So I'm just going to darken it slightly with a wash of black paint. Again, this is roughly watered down 50-50 ratio, and I'm just using the biggest brush that I could get my hand on, which is a Big Daddy brush. This is a natural bristle brush as opposed to a synthetic brush, but at this point I just wanted to whack that colour wash all over. Again, this is just going to darken the wood, and it's going to make it look like the wood is slightly older than that kind of modern pine. Again, just applying it kind of really randomly all over, and then just wiping it back, working in small areas so that it doesn't dry. I didn't want this to be like a solid kind of black piece. I just wanted it to slightly darken the Coffee Bean that was already there. So I did wipe it back again, and you can see the wood grain coming through on the drawer fronts. Again, like I say, working in small areas, and also you can kind of shade a little bit with this. So instead of just applying the black all over and just getting it kind of so that it all looked the same, I am wiping back some areas more than others so that the brown is more prominent, and some areas the black is more prominent. It just gives it a little bit more dimension and depth rather than just being one flat colour. The good thing about paint washes is that they do dry relatively quickly. This was dry in no time at all. And then I took my electric sander and I'm just going to start to really gently sand away at some of the paint washes that I've done. Again, this is to add a little bit of tonal variation, but it's also to just get that wood grain kind of visible through the paint washes, because I didn't want this to look like it was a piece that had been painted black. I wanted to look like it was a dark stain. So this is just a really fine grit sandpaper on my electric sander. I've also turned the power right down because this sander is an absolute beast. So I didn't want to sand my paint washes completely back, because obviously that would be defeating the object of doing this. But it's just enough to kind of raise, get the grain visible through the paint wash. And like I say, just give it that kind of really worn look. This is actually a really cool kind of technique just on its own. Just a few paint washes and then sand it back. It can actually look really effective. But obviously, I am kind of one of those people that want more, like more. So I couldn't stop there, because I'm going to grab my Terra paint here. So this piece is going to be mainly painted in Terra. So the two colours that I've just used for the paint washes were chalk mineral paints. And the reason I use chalk mineral paints first is because, number one, there is no brown in the Terra Clay Paint range. That's me just kind of doubting what I'm doing. I'm just going over the top of this in white. So like I say, there's no brown in the Terra Clay Paint range. There is a black, but it's very, very easily reactivated with water, Terra Clay Paint. And I am going to layer lots and lots of paint over the top of this. So I wanted that base to kind of stay where it was. So that's why I used chalk mineral paint for the paint washes. So as you can see, what I'm doing now is adding white. This colour is called Moonbeam, and from here on I'm going to be using Terra Clay Paint colours to lay it up and kind of give a really distressed kind of primitive farmhouse look. So I'm just adding this all over. The really good thing about Terra Clay Paint is that it does hold its texture really well. So you don't necessarily need to add any texture additive. You've seen me use sea spray before to get texture. You don't need to do that with this. You can add sea spray if you want a lot of texture, but it will hold a little bit of texture on its own, and it's quite a thick formula, so it's really nice to work with. As you can see, the white covers really well. I'm just stippling it on, and I'm just varying the kind of coverage. So in some areas I'm applying a lot of white, and in other areas I'm not applying hardly anything, or in some areas I'm not applying any at all. So I'm just doing this to kind of get that variation. Like I say, if I'd have just painted the entire thing in white and then another layer and then another layer, it kind of would have looked very samey all over. And this is a kind of a big flat piece with very, very little detail. So I'm going to create the detail myself with distressing. And when I distress, I like to kind of give a lot of variation and tone so that it looks authentic. I'm using a natural bristle brush to apply this with, and the reason for that is just basically because natural bristle brushes can help you get that texture. Synthetic brushes are better if you want a nice kind of smooth finish, and I tend to use natural bristle brushes to get a little bit of texture. So that's why I'm using a natural bristle brush for this. I let that white colour dry down completely before I added my next one, and the next colour is Blue Agave. I think that's how you pronounce it, I'm not sure, but it's a really nice kind of muted blue tone. I'm going to keep really muted colours on this. I actually intended on doing this blue, but as there is kind of a running joke that I can't resist a little bit of green, and I did eventually mix the perfect farmhouse green. I'll show you that further down the line. So I'm going in with this colour, and this is just going to help me give, again, a little bit of dimension, and when I distress it back, you're going to see pops of white and pops of blue. Again, I'm stippling this on with a natural bristle brush. If I was to paint this on, there is a risk that you could reactivate the white colour underneath, and they would start to mix. That's not necessarily going to be a problem, because like I say, this is not going to be my final colour, but I just find that stippling it on stops that from happening quite so much, because until Terra Clay Paint is sealed, it is very easily reactivated with water, and obviously there is water content in the paint, so if you were to kind of brush it over, it would reactivate the base colours and they would kind of all mix together. Again, I'm just adding it really, really randomly. There's no kind of rhyme or reason where I'm adding this. I'm kind of just really loosely adding areas of blue The good thing about this is you're not going to see it, so it looks like an absolute car crash disaster at the moment, but it's not going to be visible. So my idea was that I was just going to add some of the Moonbeam, which is the white, into the blue and make it into a more kind of pale blue so that you'd see the darker blue popping through. However, like I say, I then had I'd mixed it all together, made a really pretty kind of, almost like a duck eggy kind of blue, and then I had a really good idea and I was like, I'll put some green in. Why not? So I added Pistachio. Like I say, I had no intentions of turning this piece green. I was going to do a blue piece, kind of blue, farmhousey, duck eggy kind of colour. But no, it turned green. It just, I can't help myself. I feel like at this point it is an addiction. So I put some pistachio in and I mixed it up, and it actually turns out that I made a really kind of cool, minty, greeny, farmhousey kind of vibe. I really like it, but then I love green, so that's obvious. And then I just applied this all over with a Bestang brush because it's got a nice flat surface, and I'm going to stipple it all over. Again, I don't want these colours to kind of mix together and melt together. I want to keep them as separate layers. So I am really trying to not kind of brush and overwork my paint so that the green wet paint doesn't reactivate the blue and the white layers underneath. If you are worried that you are going to reactivate your paint underneath, you can seal each layer with a top coat to stop it reactivating. However, I haven't got time for that. I have done it on previous projects where I wanted to wet distress it and see certain pops of colour, but I'm not going to do it on this piece because I do want a really kind of softer, faded kind of look. So that's why I'm kind of stippling it all over. I'm just trying my best to not reactivate that paint underneath, and it didn't. Nothing reactivated. It was absolutely fine. I just carried this method on over the rest of the piece, and again I did vary the thickness of which I'm applying it in exactly the same way as I did the white and the blue. I'm applying this very randomly, and I'm also leaving patches where the paint is very, very thin on purpose, so that when I distress this back and add the top coat and the waxes, it looks like the paint has been faded away over time, and it's not just kind of been distressed and it looks really kind of samey. It kind of looks natural. Well, that's my aim anyway. Unlike the blue and the white, I am going to put this green all over the piece. So this is going to be the final colour that my piece is going to be. It's going to be predominantly green with hints of the blue, the white, and then the base colours peeping through. So this is going all over. As you can see from the kind of wider angle here, I am literally putting it all over the piece, but the distress work is going to reveal those colours that I worked up underneath. So to the distressing, the distress work is really lovely with Terra Clay Paint because it is a very kind of crumbly paint, and it does lend itself so well to that kind of distressed look. So the first thing I'm going to use is a scraper. This paint is completely dry, but you can do it when it's touch dry, and that gives you more of kind of like a crumbled kind of look. But obviously just be careful because it's still quite soft, that you can kind of take back too much of the paint when you're distressing. So I've just left mine to dry completely, and I'm taking a carbide scraper. These are really sharp, so I'm hardly applying any pressure onto it at all. And I'm going to use a combination of a few distressing techniques, as I usually do with my kind of layered looks, because I just find it looks a little bit more authentic. So I'm scraping away some of the layers, some of the thicker layers with the scraper, and then I'm just using the sandpaper to kind of go around the edges and give it more of kind of softer, worn look. And like I say, this is going to help reveal some of those layers underneath, but just make it look like the paint's faded rather than just been sanded really viciously with sandpaper. When I'm distressing a piece, I always try and think about how the piece would wear if it genuinely was an old piece, and how paint does age and peel. And I've got a few boards on Pinterest that I dedicate to kind of patina and chippy paint and old doors and things like that, because they are really useful in kind of studying to see how the kind of paint does wear naturally. For the top, I am not going to hand sand that. It's massive. So I'm going to bust out my electric sander for this. And it's going to make a quicker job of it. But just bear in mind that this paint, until it's sealed, is incredibly soft. It's not as tough as chalk mineral paint. So you can quite easily sand through all the layers that you've built up. So I've turned my power right down. I've also got a really fine grit sanding sheet on here, because you can put it back. I was going to say you can't. You can take it away, but you can't put it back. You can put it back. I'm going to show you what I did in a sec, because I did go quite heavy-handed in some areas. So on the draw fronts of some of the areas, I went a little bit too hard with my scraper or my sander, and all I'm doing is just applying some of the green back over the top in areas, and this is just going to, it acts as an eraser. So if you've obviously gone a little bit too heavy with your distressing, you can just layer it over the top. This look is really forgiving because it's not a perfectly painted piece. So if you've got a perfectly painted piece and you touch an area up that might have got damaged or scuffed, it stands out like a sore thumb. Whereas this technique, because it is really heavily layered and there's lots of different kind of variation in the colour, it kind of lends itself really well anyway to it. So you don't have to be too precious about this. And it really goes down to personal preference. Obviously, there's some areas that I just thought I'm not happy with. It looked a little bit too kind of forced. So that's why I'm adding that kind of dry brushing back in. And then to seal it, I'm going to use Terra Tough. This is fast becoming my favourite top coat. And I use this not only over Terra, but I've used this over chalk mineral paint. And I've also used it as a top coat over no paint gel stain. It is so easy to use and it's really durable as well. It's kind of similar to Gator Hide, which is also a Dixie Belle top coat. But this has been specifically made to work with Terra Clay Paint because, as I mentioned earlier in the video, it is really easily reactivated with water, and obviously top coats that I use are water based. So the last thing you want to do is apply a top coat over your layers of paint that you've layered up and then distressed and it looks spot on, only for your top coat to pull those off again. So this top coat will not do that. It does not reactivate. Don't ask me how. The technology is fantastic. The science is amazing. I don't know how it does it, but it does it. And it just leaves a really nice kind of shine. I really like this top coat over Terra Clay Paint. It works really well. And as you can see, the colours go deeper. So Terra Clay Paint dries a lot lighter than what it applies on as when the paint is wet. But when you apply your top coat, it goes back to that kind of darker shade. When I'm applying a top coat over the top of something that's heavily textured like this, I tend to use a brush because I find the bristles get in all the texture a little bit better. If I'm applying a top coat over a very smooth surface, I'll use a foam and dandy brush because I find that just applies over that smooth finish better than a brush and reduces the chance of streakiness, whereas a textured finish is slightly more forgiving when you're top coating anyway. I applied 2 coats of Terra Tough and just allow it to dry thoroughly between applications if you are applying more than 1 coat. And then I'm obviously going to put some wax on it because if you know me and you know my pieces, I use wax on most of my stuff. So although I can't seal Terra Clay Paint with Best Dang wax because it's just not a compatible product with Terra Clay Paint, you can use Best Dang wax over the top of your dried top coat. So I'm going to use black and brown waxes to create a lot of depth and dimension, and I'm just using it with a dry chip brush and I'm concentrating the areas kind of around the edges of the drawers. That's just going to help give it loads of dimension because, like I say, the drawers are really flat and kind of boring. So I'm going in with a little bit of black here. You can mix waxes, so the brown wax is obviously still wet on the surface, and I'm going in with a little bit of black. That's just going to deepen the brown slightly but still give me that kind of antique-y look. Again, the thing with wax is not to be too precious about it because it's so easily wiped back and removed if you do go in a little bit heavy with it. And also, we don't want symmetry. You don't want all of your drawer fronts to look exactly the same. So just make it kind of really random and that will look more authentic. And then I just wiped it back so that it's basically not going to stay tacky, and that just removes the excess and kind of works it into all of the texture, as you can see in a couple of these close-ups. I did also add some catalogue card holder kind of little label holders to the top right hand drawer. There is no filming of me doing that because that took me a long time. I say it took me a long time, it took Andy a long time. So there's the close-ups, here's the finished piece. I hope you enjoyed the video, hit subscribe and I will catch you next time.